But what I would like to talk about today is, I guess, differs slightly from the approach just before, which looked very much at what you might call the kind of co-optation of blockchain more broadly by kind of governments, financial institutions, and so on, and the kind of spin that happens on that. I want to discuss a little bit the kind of pre-histories of blockchain and some of the kind of ideas that gave rise to the proposition of blockchain that I argue come from explicitly anti-authoritarian kind of technologies. And it's recognizing these anti-authoritarian roots kind of explains a lot of things. It explains partially the kind of awkwardness that comes about through the co-optation by institutions and so on, in that what usually, when you dig deeper into the use of blockchain by financial institutions or governments, you find out quite quickly that it simply doesn't really make sense. Like, it's not really a blockchain what they're building. It's usually just a database or this kind of thing. And so it's used more as a kind of PR stunt word. Or at other times it's used explicitly as a kind of for a deregulation agenda. So there is anti-authoritarian tendencies in blockchain technology, and this is really where the roots of the technology comes from. So that's what I'm going to be talking about a little bit in relation to something that I wrote that you presented just before, the Satoshi Oath, that I wrote with Elias Haze from a company called B9 Lab. And we wrote that oath at an interesting time of blockchain development. It was just before the DAO exploit / hack, however you choose to see it, in Ethereum. And it was kind of as the Bitcoin scaling conflict was growing and becoming more intense. And we wrote the oath in response to, sorry, I actually want to bring the oath up so that you can read it. In response to a certain kind of understanding of how blockchain technology solves the problem of authority that we were finding particularly problematic. So that's what I want to try and explain to you today. Yeah, this is my slide on authority. Now you understood my point on authority. So this is the Satoshi Oath. These are the main points of the Satoshi Oath. Underneath each of these main points, we had a few questions that we suggested that blockchain developers ask themselves as they're developing blockchain. So what I wanted to do today was explain why we chose these particular points to put forward to blockchain developers. So first of all, immutability. Immutability was a promise that blockchain presented very much at that time. It was the idea of we have a kind of a linear chain of data that nobody is able to change once it's there, once consensus has been reached around that about that data, no one can change it. Why? Because in Bitcoin, obviously, if anyone can change it, then you kind of disrupt, the whole system kind of falls apart because anyone can invent new transactions and so on. But also because if anyone can change the data, they essentially become a new form of authority. So anyone that can change the record of events becomes a new form of authority, and so therefore we need to promise immutability. Then the DAO exploit happened. It turned out, okay, things aren't always as immutable as we promised them to be. There are certain kind of circumstances where we might want to change what's written in the ledger. And so this was written just before the DAO exploit, and simply all we wanted to ask was who has the power to change the ledger and under what conditions, and how is that going to take place? Because change is going to have to happen. The world is never as certain as we think it is, regardless of how many cryptographic proofs we layer on top and so on and so forth. The world is a messy place, and that's the world that we live in. And so therefore, it was a reminder to developers to think about, okay, who has the power to change what's in the ledger, under what conditions, and how does that take place? Since then, there's been a kind of process for that developed in the community largely. Forking is kind of become one of the kind of acceptable ways to change the ledger. So that was the kind of main, that was the first point. Neutrality. So again, the question of neutrality at that time there was this idea, you know, one of the main points of blockchains was to get rid of authority, right? So what do we replace authority with? So we have this decentralized system. The idea of decentralization is to disintermediate. So we get rid of authority by disintermediating authority. What happens in the meantime, and this is something that, let's say, is the foundation for a lot of the work and a lot of the research that I do, is obviously a kind of re-intermediation takes place, right? So you get rid of authority and instead you have a protocol. And that protocol is obviously, you know, written by someone. The protocol has certain rules. Those rules are, you know, we can claim they're neutral. We can hope there is no such thing as neutrality when it comes down to it, right? And a lot of the kind of these questions again came up in the year or two after we wrote this. In the Bitcoin scaling conflict, in the Ethereum DAO hack, it's like, well, it turns out the protocol itself, you know, not only is it not neutral, it's going to always need maintenance, right? It's going to always need fixing. And you know, in terms of who decides what is a bug or what needs to be fixed or not, that is a question, right? That's, you know, how does that take place? So on the question of neutrality, it was very much this idea of addressing the concept of a neutral protocol and say, hey, wait, there is no, you know, neutral protocol in that sense. You know, what needs to be thought about in writing protocols is really what is being delegated to this particular protocol for execution through a protocol rather than through other means, right? So if we think about how blockchain technology was supposed to replace kind of certain maybe kind of legal processes, for example, we can understand legal processes as one way of executing a certain thing which has a certain quality, and a protocol or a piece of code as another way of executing a certain thing, and it has a different quality of execution. There's a different kind of relationship to how things are executed. In a legal process, you have recourse in certain ways through established kind of practices. With code, the recourse and the accountabilities is things that still need to be worked on, you know, especially in the field of blockchain. It needs some work. We haven't quite understood the qualitative change that happens, you know, when we implement smart contracts, for example, over other forms of execution of legal agreements. So it was really to point to the kind of the qualitative differences between, you know, a protocol is not just a neutral thing. And also, so to the question of delegation, so to really make the developer think, okay, what is being delegated to this piece of code for automated execution, you know? And on the question of disclosure, to talk a bit about can we fully disclose this delegation, and who do we need to disclose it to, in the sense of anyone who's affected by this particular protocol, this particular piece of code, you know, to make it understood by them, not just making the code open source, you know, fine, but not everyone can read, you know, the implications of a given code base. But to really disclose fully, you know, and honestly to anyone who might be affected by the given code, this is what's going on. And then decentralization, another, you know, the main buzzword, let's say, the main kind of idea and purpose of blockchain. Let's get rid of authority by replacing it with a decentralized system. And so here again, it was to point to the idea that decentralization, you know, and again, this is like probably one of the main strategies that I use in my work, is to really trace through exactly what does a concept like decentralization mean in different contexts, right? So decentralization has functioned incredibly well, unbelievably well in mobilizing ideas, attention, interest, affiliation to the project of blockchain, because it really captures a lot of people's imagination, especially in this period of time. But obviously, blockchain is one particular kind of implementation of something that's maybe decentralized sometimes. It's a very specific operationalization of the world, let's say, with particular histories, with particular rationalities, and you know, the history in peer-to-peer technology is a history that I trace through a lot. But so, because decentralization can be encoded and enacted in many different ways, it also means that it's not like a final solution to anything, right? It's not like we've found the golden version of decentralization. So one of the points that I wanted to raise, and again, it was very interesting to see how it came up in the DAO exploit and the Bitcoin scaling conflict, is the question of dissensus. So, you know, I'm in a decentralized network, and, you know, we have a consensus algorithm. The consensus algorithm makes sure that, you know, we're all kind of inputting. We want to make this transaction, it organizes our transactions, and then it puts on the blockchain and so on. Where do I go if I disagree? How do I disagree in a decentralized system like that? And what can I disagree with? Can I disagree with the particular transaction that got verified? Can I disagree with the rules of the protocol itself? You know, and where and how does that take place? You know, how do I express dissensus? What is the dissensus mechanism of the blockchain? So that was one thing that we wanted to point the attention towards. And then the other question was the question of exodus. How easy is it for me to leave the system? If I don't want to use this particular decentralized system, how easy is it for me to pick up and leave? And this comes down to the question of risk also, that, you know, like there is different kinds of risks that people, you know, decentralization can be something that's empowering, but it can also be, you can decentralize power, or you can decentralize risk, right? And in blockchain, the question is a little bit like this. We don't quite know, you know. For some people, it can be very empowering. For other people, it's really like, actually, you're putting yourselves in a much more risky situation because there's very little recourse to very few accountability structures that have been developed. So that's the kind of introduction to the Satoshi oath that we developed at that time. A lot of the kinds of lessons and questions that we hope to bring up. So initially, I have to say, when I wrote it, I kind of knew what the reactions were going to be from the blockchain kind of community at that time, in the sense that one of the aims of blockchain was to solve the problem of politics and solve the problem of ethics and we found this kind of objective means of organizing society. So we don't need any like moral oath thing on top of that. It's like, and also a moral oath thing can just be too easily gamed, you know, just like, you know, any other kind of layer that you need something that is like absolutely, completely secure, you know, can't be hacked, this kind of thing. We need cryptographic proofs. So, and also, you know, code is law, you know, so anything that is layered on top of that, or that is perceived to be layered on top of that, I knew was going to be met with a lot of resistance. And that's, you know, initially it was very kind of people like, oh, you know, this is like, oh, this, you know, this ethical thing that like we, you know, it's not hard enough. It's not going to stand up to the real world. And then, you know, in just, you know, not long after, when things start to get complicated and the scaling conflict was happening and so on, and people started to realize actually human power dynamics are very much part of the blockchain world. It's not something that's going to go away or be solved finally through this kind of miracle protocol. Yeah, it was pointing at some real questions that I think are still relevant today. So, yeah, hopefully that gave a little bit of an idea of the Satoshi oath, but also a little bit an idea of the kind of more specific politics that are really coming out of that space. That point to, I would say, like the ways that words like consensus, trust, decentralization, authority, autonomy, you know, mean something very specific when you look at it in the history of kind of decentralized anti-authoritarian history, or anti-authoritarian technology, and in the sense that they mean something specific, it also means that the possibilities that are opened up by blockchain is not like some kind of like vague overall kind of solution to something. No, it's a very specific kind of interesting new form of intermediation. It doesn't solve the problem of intermediation. It's a new interesting form of mediating our relationships that can be very, very problematic in some cases, and it can be very interesting to play around with in other cases. But it's specific. It doesn't solve anything in any final way. it's a new mediation. It's a new form of mediation. So I think I'll wrap it up there.